The thing about living with an alien, Marcus Webb had discovered, was that you learned to stop making assumptions about what was normal. 3 weeks into the paired habitation initiative, he'd adjusted to Solara's habit of humming in frequencies just below human hearing range, her preference for keeping their shared quarters at temperatures that made him constantly reach for a jacket, and her extremely specific opinions about how towels should be folded. What he hadn't adjusted to was how little he actually knew about her. She was unfailingly polite, meticulously respectful of his space, and completely opaque about anything personal. Every conversation felt like a carefully choreographed dance, where they discussed weather patterns on various colony worlds and the quality of the station's recycled water, but never anything that mattered. Marcus had volunteered for this program specifically because he wanted to understand other species better. As a human anthropologist, he'd spent his career studying cultures from a distance, analyzing data and reading reports. The Paired Habitation Initiative promised something different: actual immersion, daily life with someone whose entire evolutionary history had unfolded light years from Earth. Solara Kent was Velisari, a species that had joined the Galactic Union roughly 2 centuries before humanity. They were known for elegant architecture, complex poetry, and diplomatic skills that made them natural mediators in interspecies conflicts. They were also known, Marcus had learned, for being exceptionally private about emotional matters. Solara embodied that reputation perfectly. She was tall by human standards, with the characteristic features of her species: copper-toned skin, eyes with elongated pupils that could adjust to different light spectrums, and ears that were longer and more expressive than human ones, capable of subtle movements that conveyed meaning Marcus was still learning to read. Currently, those ears were held in a carefully neutral position as she stood in the doorway of their shared quarters, her hands clasped in the formal Velisari greeting posture. "Marcus," she said, her accent giving his name a musical quality that standard Galactic never quite achieved, "I must request something of you. It is traditional in nature." Marcus looked up from his data pad, where he'd been reviewing notes on Velisari cultural festivals. "Of course, what do you need?" Solara's ears tilted slightly backward, hesitation, if he remembered correctly. "Tomorrow marks the night of shared grief in our calendar. It is an observance for those who have lost someone dear. There is a ritual called Keshartan that tradition requires." "I'm not familiar with it," Marcus admitted. "What does it involve?" "It is simple in execution, though significant in meaning. 2 individuals lie together in rest, sharing space in silence. It is meant to acknowledge that grief, while personal, need not be borne in complete isolation." She paused. "I would request that you participate with me as my quarters partner. It would satisfy the traditional requirements." Marcus tried to hide his surprise. This was the most personal request Solara had made since they'd started living together. "You want me to lie down with you, that's it." "In the designated rest area, yes. For 1 cycle, approximately 4 of your hours. We would simply rest together in silence. It is ceremonial more than functional." Her ears remained carefully controlled. "I understand if this makes you uncomfortable. I could petition the Cultural Exchange Office for a formal exemption, though it would require extensive documentation." "No, it's fine," Marcus said quickly. "I'm happy to help. What time should we do this?" "The ritual begins at sunset by station time. I will prepare the space according to tradition." She inclined her head in the Velisari gesture of gratitude. "Thank you, Marcus. Your accommodation of our customs is appreciated." She retreated to her private quarters before he could respond, leaving Marcus alone with a growing sense that he just agreed to something more significant than a simple cultural formality. He spent the next hour searching through the cultural databases, trying to find detailed information about Keshartan and the Night of Shared Grief. The results were frustratingly sparse. Velisari grief traditions were mentioned in general terms. They valued emotional control, viewed public mourning as unseemly, emphasized the importance of processing loss through structured rituals. But specifics about Keshartan were limited to brief descriptions that matched what Solara had told him. A ritual observance where two people shared rest space to acknowledge grief. Nothing about its deeper significance. Nothing about what it meant beyond the surface action. Marcus closed his data pad, feeling the familiar frustration of trying to understand a culture through second-hand information. Tomorrow night, he'd participate in the actual tradition. Maybe that would teach him more than any database could. The next day passed with unusual tension. Solara went about her normal routine, working her shift at the Xenobiology Research Wing, preparing her meals with the same precise timing she always maintained. But Marcus noticed small details that suggested her careful composure was costing her more than usual. Her ears kept shifting position when she thought he wasn't looking, moving through expressions he couldn't quite interpret. She forgot her data pad when leaving for work, something he'd never seen her do before. And when she returned that evening, her movements had a mechanical quality, as if she was forcing herself through each action by sheer will. "I will prepare the ritual space now," she announced after their evening meal, which she'd barely touched. Marcus watched as she transformed their shared living area. She moved the low table to one side and arranged cushions and textiles on the floor in specific patterns, deep blues and silvers that seemed to shimmer in the station's artificial light. She lit candles that produced a soft, blue-green glow and released a scent Marcus couldn't identify, something between rain and stone. When she emerged from her quarters wearing traditional morning attire, a flowing garment that caught the candlelight like captured stars, Marcus felt his breath catch. She looked both beautiful and profoundly sad, though her face maintained its careful neutrality. "The ritual requires us to lie side by side," Solara explained, gesturing to the prepared space. "We maintain respectful distance, hands folded, breathing synchronized. I will recite the traditional words, and then we observe silence until dawn by station time." "I understand," Marcus said, though he wasn't sure he understood anything at all. They lay down on the cushions, maintaining a proper distance between them. The textiles were surprisingly comfortable, and the candlelight created shadows that danced across the ceiling. Solara began speaking in Old Velisari, her voice taking on a rhythmic quality that the translator didn't even attempt to process. The words washed over Marcus like water, musical, mournful, beautiful in ways he couldn't articulate. When she finished, silence settled over them like a physical weight. At first, Marcus simply focused on breathing steadily, trying to match Solara's rhythm as she'd instructed. It felt awkward, lying motionless while fully aware of another person beside him. His human instincts wanted to fidget, to break the silence, to do something active. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, Marcus found himself adapting to the stillness. There was something meditative about it, something that quieted the constant noise of his thoughts and let him simply exist in the moment. That's when he started noticing the details. Solara's breathing wasn't as steady as it first appeared. Every few minutes, it would hitch slightly, as if she was suppressing something. Her hands, folded formally on her chest, trembled with barely perceptible movement. And her ears, despite her obvious efforts to control them, kept tilting backward in the position he'd learned indicated pain or deep distress. Marcus lay very still, his anthropologist training kicking in. This wasn't just a formal tradition. Something else was happening here, something Solara hadn't explained, or couldn't explain. He turned his head slightly to look at her. In the candlelight, her face was a mask of perfect Velisari composure, serene, controlled, giving away nothing. But her eyes were closed, and he could see the tension in her jaw, the way her throat worked as if she was swallowing words that wanted to escape. As the second hour began, Marcus saw it, a single tear escaping from her closed eye, tracing a slow path down her temple toward her ear. She was crying. Silently, carefully, with the same controlled precision she brought to everything else. And she was doing it while lying alone, next to someone who wasn't supposed to notice. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't a simple cultural formality. This was Solara's way of grieving in a society that demanded she do it alone, that required emotional control even in her most vulnerable moments. She'd asked him to participate not because tradition demanded it, but because she couldn't bear to face this night in complete isolation. And she'd assumed he wouldn't notice her pain. Marcus made a decision that would change everything, though he didn't know it yet. Slowly, carefully, he reached across the small distance between them and took her hand. For 3 heartbeats, Solara went completely rigid. Her hand in his felt like carved stone, every muscle locked in shock. Marcus had violated the ritual's formal distance, broken the protocol she'd so carefully explained. Then her fingers closed around his with crushing strength, and she made a sound that broke his heart. It started as a gasp, a sharp intake of breath like someone surfacing from deep water. Then it transformed into quiet, desperate weeping, the kind that came from months or years of suppression, from grief that had been forced into silence and could no longer be contained. "I apologize," she managed between sobs, her words switching erratically between Standard and Velisari as her translator struggled to keep up. "This is unseemly. I should maintain I cannot." "Don't," Marcus said quietly, tightening his grip on her hand. "Don't apologize, just whatever you need to do." And Solara broke. The words spilled out in fragments, sometimes in Standard, sometimes in her native tongue, creating a mosaic of pain that Marcus pieced together as he listened. She spoke of Torian, her bonded partner, a term that her species used for relationships deeper than human marriage, something that involved psychological connection Marcus could barely comprehend. Torian had died in a laboratory accident 14 months ago, a containment failure in a xenobiology experiment that killed 3 researchers instantly. Velisari culture, she explained through her tears, valued emotional control above almost everything else. Public grief was considered weakness. She'd been expected to perform the Keshartan ritual alone, demonstrating her strength by facing her sorrow in dignified isolation. "But I could not," she whispered, her voice raw. 14 months of silence, Marcus. 14 months of maintaining composure while everything inside me screamed. I thought if someone was here, even someone who did not understand, it would be easier. I thought a human would not know what this ritual truly meant, that your presence would be impersonal enough to satisfy tradition while giving me something, anything, to anchor to." Her grip on his hand tightened painful. "Lie. I did not expect you to notice. I did not expect you to respond." Marcus shifted slightly, turning on his side to face her. The ritual's formal positions were already abandoned, so he might as well commit to offering actual comfort rather than ceremonial distance. "Solara, you were trying to hide pain while tears were literally falling from your eyes. Of course I noticed. Velisari are taught to manage such displays. You should not have been able to see." She finally opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. In the candlelight they were luminous with tears. "Your species is more perceptive than we have credited. Or maybe you're not as good at hiding as you think," Marcus said gently. "Pain is pain, regardless of what species is feeling it. And you've been carrying this alone for 14 months. It is our way, strength through control, dignity through restraint." Her ears had finally abandoned their neutral position, tilting backward in an expression of pure anguish. "But I am not strong enough, Marcus. I am failing at the most basic requirement of my culture, to process grief with Thank you for your participation in the ritual," she said in formal tones that sounded nothing like the broken, honest voice from hours before. "Your accommodation of our traditions is deeply appreciated. Solara, I apologize for my display. It was inappropriate and must have been uncomfortable for you. I will ensure it does not happen again." She stood, moving with stiff precision toward her private quarters. "If you will excuse me, I have duties to attend to." She disappeared behind her door before Marcus could respond, leaving him lying alone in the ritual space surrounded by guttering candles and the lingering scent of grief. He sat up slowly, his hand still remembering the desperate strength of her grip. Something profound had happened during that ritual, something that went beyond cultural exchange or anthropological observation. He'd connected with Solara in a way that felt significant, important, real. He had no idea that by offering comfort during Keshartan, he just triggered a chain of diplomatic complications that would force both of them to confront exactly what that connection meant. His communication device chimed with an urgent priority message. Report to Cultural Liaison Office immediately. Matter of significant diplomatic concern. Dr. Vasquez Marcus looked at the message, then at Solara's closed door, then back at the message. What the hell did I just do? He muttered to himself. But somewhere underneath the confusion and concern, he felt something else, certainty. Whatever complications were coming, whatever diplomatic nightmare this turned into, he'd made the right choice. Solara had been hurting and he'd responded. In his mind, that was reason enough for anything that followed. He just hoped the universe agreed. The Cultural Liaison Office occupied a section of Constellation Station that Marcus had never visited before. The corridors here were wider, designed to accommodate species with different mobility requirements, and the walls displayed real-time translations in 17 languages. It was the bureaucratic heart of interspecies cooperation, and right now, it looked like that heart was having palpitations. Dr. Helena Vasquez met him at the entrance. She was a compact woman with sharp eyes and the kind of exhausted expression that suggested she'd been awake for far too long dealing with a crisis she hadn't anticipated. "Mr. Webb," she said without preamble, "we need to talk about what happened last night." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "How do you know what happened last night?" "All paired habitation participants are monitored for safety and research purposes. It's in the contract you signed." She gestured him toward a private conference room. "We don't actively surveil personal moments, but the Velisari cultural observers flagged your Keshartan ritual for immediate review. What you did has implications." The conference room contained 3 humans and 2 Velisari officials. Everyone looked varying degrees of stressed and confused. Dr. Vasquez pulled up a holographic display showing footage from last night. Marcus reaching across to take Solara's hand, the moment when the formal ritual transformed into something else entirely. "This action," one of the Velisari observers said, her ears held in a rigidly formal position, "has been interpreted by traditional authorities as accepting the role of Kesharvel. The term translates imperfectly to standard, but it means approximately grief-bearer or soul companion." "I was just trying to comfort her," Marcus protested. "She was crying. What was I supposed to do? Ignore it?" "In Velisari culture," the observer explained, "Keshartan is performed alone or with someone who has accepted deep responsibility for your emotional well-being. Offering physical comfort during the ritual is understood as accepting that responsibility. You claimed the role of Kesharvel, whether you intended to or not." Dr. Vasquez rubbed her temples. "In practical terms, Marcus, you've just entered into a culturally recognized bond that gives you certain rights and responsibilities within Solara's family clan. It's not quite marriage, but it's close. And it was absolutely not part of the cultural exchange parameters." "Wait," Marcus held up his hands. "I held her hand because she was obviously suffering. That's it. I'm not trying to marry into an alien family or claim any rights, or—" "Your intentions are irrelevant," the second Velisari observer interrupted. "The ritual has meaning beyond personal interpretation. What you did has cultural weight that exists independent of your understanding." "So what happens now?" Marcus asked, though he was fairly certain he didn't want to know the answer. Dr. Vasquez exchanged glances with the other humans. "The Velisari leadership is divided. Progressive factions see this as proof that interspecies emotional bonds are possible and should be encouraged. Traditional factions believe you cannot possibly fulfill the obligations of Kesharvel, and that Solara has dishonored herself by accepting comfort from an outsider. Meanwhile, one of the human officials added, "We have a diplomatic incident on our hands. The cultural exchange program is supposed to be about observation and mutual understanding, not participants forming legally recognized bonds that neither government anticipated." Marcus felt anger rising in his chest. So everyone's concerned about diplomatic complications and protocol violations. Has anyone asked what Solara wants? The room fell silent. "I want to talk to her," Marcus said firmly, "privately, right now." Dr. Vasquez started to object, then seemed to reconsider. "Fine, but understand that whatever you two decide, there will be consequences. This isn't something that can be swept under the rug with a polite apology." They brought Solara to a different conference room, smaller and more private. She entered with perfect Velisari composure, her morning attire replaced by practical work clothing, her ears held in carefully neutral position. When she saw Marcus, something flickered in her expression before the mask reasserted itself. "I have been informed of the situation," she said before Marcus could speak. "I apologize for creating this diplomatic complication. It was not my intention. Solara, I will formally renounce the Kesharvel bond. It will cause some dishonor to my family name, but less than allowing the bond to continue with someone who did not understand its implications when accepting it." Her voice was perfectly level, giving away nothing. "You will be freed from any obligations, and the cultural exchange program can continue without further complications." Marcus stared at her, recognizing the careful control, the emotional armor she'd rebuilt overnight. She was retreating back into the isolation that was killing her, and she was doing it to spare him inconvenience. "No," he said. Her ears twitched. "Excuse me. I said no. I'm not accepting a renouncement, and you're not doing this alone anymore. Marcus, you do not understand what you are saying. The role of Kesharvel carries responsibilities that... I understand that you were crying yourself to sleep for 14 months trying to grieve alone because your culture demands it. I understand that when I held your hand last night, you held on like you were drowning, and I was the only thing keeping you afloat. I understand that sending me away means going back to that loneliness." He stepped closer. "What I don't understand is why I should let you suffer alone when I can help. It is not your responsibility. Then I'm making it my responsibility. If your culture interprets what I did as some kind of bond, fine. If it means I'm supposed to support you through grief, I accept that." Solara's composure was cracking. "Why? Why would you accept obligations to someone you barely know? Why would you risk diplomatic complications and cultural misunderstandings for my grief?" Marcus thought about all the careful, academic answers he could give. About his training in anthropology, about the importance of cross-cultural understanding, about abstract principles of human compassion. Instead, he told her the simple truth. "Because you were hurting and I could help. That's reason enough." The careful control shattered. Solara's ears tilted backward in that expression of anguish he'd seen last night, and tears began falling despite her obvious attempts to stop them. "That is not, you cannot simply," she struggled for words. "In my culture, acknowledging another's pain so directly, accepting responsibility for bearing it with them, this is the highest honor one can offer. It is not done lightly. It is not done for strangers. Then maybe I'm not a stranger anymore." She stared at him, and Marcus saw the exact moment she made her decision. Her ears shifted forward, acceptance, if he read it correctly, and she reached out to take his hand with the same desperate grip from the night before. "If you truly mean this," she said quietly, "if you understand that Kesharvel is not temporary or casual, that it binds us in ways that will affect both our lives permanently. I understand enough. And what I don't understand, you can teach me." Solara nodded slowly. "Then I accept your support, and I will try to be worthy of it. You already are." They stood there in the conference room, hands joined, while outside the diplomatic machinery of two species tried to process what this meant for interspecies relations and cultural exchange protocols. Marcus found he didn't particularly care about the diplomatic implications. What mattered was that Solara was no longer facing her grief alone. Everything else, they'd figure out as they went. The diplomatic fallout was predictably messy. Human officials worried about precedent and legal implications. Velisari traditionalists debated whether a human could possibly understand the obligations of Kesharvel. Progressive factions on both sides celebrated it as proof that emotional bonds could transcend species boundaries. Marcus and Solara ignored most of it. They returned to their shared quarters and began the complicated process of figuring out what their new reality actually meant. Solara explained the traditions and expectations of Kesharvel, how it required the grief-bearer to actively participate in processing the loss, to share in mourning rituals, to provide emotional support without judgment or expectation of reciprocation. Marcus listened and learned, discovering that Velisari grief traditions were far more complex and beautiful than the sparse database entries had suggested. There were poems meant to be recited at specific times, meditations designed to process different aspects of loss, even specific meals prepared to honor different memories. "We believe grief is not something to overcome but something to integrate," Solara explained one evening, teaching him to prepare a traditional remembrance dish. "The goal is not to forget or move past, but to carry the loss as part of who you become." "That's actually similar to some human grief philosophies," Marcus said, carefully following her instructions for combining ingredients in precise order. "We just tend to be less ritualistic about it. Your approach seems more improvisational. We prefer adaptable." He grinned. "But yeah, we make it up as we go a lot more than you do." Over the following weeks, Marcus learned the rhythms of Velisari mourning. He participated in dawn meditations where Solara spoke memories of Torian aloud, helping her preserve them in words. He sat with her during evening silences, where they simply existed together without expectation of conversation. He learned the grief poetry she'd mentioned, struggling with the old Velisari pronunciation but improving with her patient correction. "Your accent is atrocious," she said one evening, though her ears were tilted forward in amusement. "You sound like you are reading a technical manual, not honoring the dead." "I'm trying. Your language has sounds that human vocal cords weren't designed for. Then we must adapt the poems for human capability." Torian would have appreciated that. He always believed traditions should serve people, not the other way around. It was the first time Solara had spoken Torian's name without pain tightening her voice. Marcus noticed, and from her expression so did she. "It is getting easier," she said quietly. "Having someone to share this with, being able to speak his name without feeling like I am failing at proper emotional control. You have given me something I did not know I needed. That's what Kesharvel means, right? Sharing the weight so it's easier to carry." "Precisely." She paused. "Though I worry you are bearing more than your share. I have given you my grief, my cultural obligations, my complicated family connections. What have you received in return?" Marcus thought about that. The past weeks had been challenging, learning new customs, navigating Velisari family politics when Solara's clan leaders contacted them, dealing with station administrators who still weren't sure how to classify their relationship. But he'd also experienced something remarkable. He'd learned a completely new approach to processing loss. He'd formed a genuine connection with someone from a species he'd only studied academically before. He discovered that compassion didn't need to understand everything to be valuable. Sometimes simply witnessing another person's pain was enough. "I've received a lot," he said finally, understanding I couldn't have gained any other way. "A friendship that matters. The knowledge that I can make a real difference in someone's life just by showing up and being present." Solara's ears tilted forward in what he'd learned was Velisari affection. "You have an uncomplicated way of viewing complex situations. It is refreshing. I prefer to think of it as cutting through unnecessary complexity to focus on what actually matters. That is the same thing I said, but with more words. Welcome to human communication. We use 5 words when one would do. She made that sound that was almost a laugh, still rare, but becoming more frequent. It was one of the small victories Marcus had learned to treasure. 3 months into their Kesharvel bond, the station administrators called them in for a formal review. Dr. Vasquez looked considerably less stressed than the last time they'd met. "I'll be honest," she said, pulling up holographic charts showing their integration metrics. "When this situation first developed, I thought it would be a disaster for the program, but the data suggests otherwise. Your bond has actually improved cross-cultural understanding outcomes across the entire station." "How so?" Marcus asked. Other participants are asking more personal questions of their partners, engaging more deeply with cultural practices instead of just observing them. You two demonstrated that genuine connection is possible, even when cultures seem incompatible. It's exactly what this program was supposed to achieve, just not through the methods we anticipated. One of the Velisari observers, the same woman who'd been present at the first meeting, inclined her head respectfully. The traditionalist factions have also reconsidered their positions. Your dedication to learning our grief customs, Mr. Webb, and your respect for their deeper meanings, has convinced many that interspecies Kesharvel bonds can be honorable if approached with proper seriousness. "I'm just doing what felt right," Marcus said. "Which is precisely why it works," the observer replied. "Authenticity cannot be replicated through protocol." The meeting concluded with official recognition of their Kesharvel status, documented, sanctioned, and integrated into both human and Velisari cultural exchange frameworks. What had started as a diplomatic crisis had transformed into a template for deeper connection. As they left the office, Solara took Marcus's hand, a gesture that had become natural between them. "Strange to think," she said, "that 14 months ago I believed I would carry my grief alone forever, that my culture's demands would isolate me completely. And now I understand that tradition can adapt without losing meaning. That strength includes knowing when to accept help, that a human I barely knew could become." She paused, searching for the right word. "Kesharvel?" Marcus suggested. "I was going to say friend, but yes, that too." They returned to their quarters, where the evening ritual awaited, the one they'd developed together, combining Velisari grief customs with human flexibility. Some nights they spoke memories aloud. Some nights they sat in companionable silence. Some nights they simply existed together, finding comfort in shared presence. Tonight, Solara retrieved a small object from her private quarters, something Marcus hadn't seen before. It was a holographic projector, old and carefully maintained. "Torian made this," she said, activating it. A 3-dimensional image appeared, a Velisari man with kind eyes and ears permanently tilted forward in amusement. It was his hobby, creating holographic art. This is the last piece he completed before the accident. The hologram showed a landscape, somewhere on the Velisari homeworld Marcus guessed. Mountains rising into a copper sky, vegetation that moved in ways Earth plants never could, and 2 figures standing together, clearly Solara and Torian. "It is beautiful," Marcus said softly. "It was his vision of our future. A place we would visit together, a moment we would share." Solara's voice was steady, though her ears tilted backward slightly. "I could not look at it for months without breaking down. The gap between what he imagined and what actually happened was too painful. And now I can see it as what it was meant to be, a gift of his love, his hope, his creativity. The pain is still there, but it does not consume everything else." She looked at Marcus. "You helped me reach this point, by being willing to see my grief, to sit with it, to help me carry it until I could bear it myself again. That's what Kesharvel means, right? It means far more than I ever explained. It means you became part of my healing without demanding anything in return. It means you honored Torian's memory by helping me remember him with love instead of only pain. She deactivated the hologram carefully. In Velisari culture, such a debt can never be fully repaid. I don't want repayment, I want you to be okay. I am getting there slowly, with your help. She paused. The grief will never disappear completely, but it is becoming something I can live with, rather than something that prevents me from living. They spent the evening sharing stories, Solara telling memories of Torian, Marcus sharing his own experiences with loss and the humans he'd grieved. It was the first time they'd spoken as equals in sorrow, rather than bearer and burden. Weeks turned into months. The official cultural exchange period ended, but neither Marcus nor Solara requested reassignment. Their Kesharvel bond had evolved into genuine partnership, not romantic, as some observers assumed, but something equally profound. They were companions who'd met in grief and found unexpected healing through connection. Marcus continued his anthropological work, now with insights into Velisari culture that no academic study could have provided. Solara returned to her xenobiology research, her work benefiting from the emotional stability she'd regained. They maintained their shared quarters, having discovered that living together had become comfortable rather than obligatory. One evening, nearly 6 months after the night of shared grief, Solara made an announcement. I have been asked to present at the Velisari Council on Cultural Exchange. They want to understand how our Kesharvel bond functions, whether it could serve as a model for other interspecies relationships. What will you tell them? Marcus asked. She considered carefully. I will tell them that grief is universal, even if the expressions of it differ. That compassion transcends cultural boundaries when it is genuine. That sometimes the most profound connections form when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable with those who have the courage to witness that vulnerability. That's pretty philosophical. I have had time to think. Her ears tilted forward in affection, and an excellent example of human compassion to learn from. I just held your hand because you were crying. You did far more than that. You saw past my mask to the pain I was trying to hide. You responded to that pain with kindness instead of discomfort. You accepted responsibilities you didn't fully understand because helping mattered more than convenience. She paused. These are not small things, Marcus. These are the foundations of genuine connection. The presentation to the Velisari Council happened remotely, with Marcus present to answer questions about the human perspective on their bond. The council members, a mix of traditional and progressive factions, listened with the intense focus that Velisari gave to matters of cultural significance. When they finished, the eldest council member spoke, her ears held in the position that indicated deep respect. What you have demonstrated is that our grief traditions need not isolate us, even from those who do not share our culture. The human capacity for empathy, combined with Velisari's structure for processing loss, has created something new and valuable. We will consider how this might inform future cultural exchanges. After the transmission ended, Solara turned to Marcus with an expression he'd learned meant gratitude mixed with amusement. You realize what we have done. Started a revolution in Velisari grief customs. Forced my extremely traditional people to reconsider centuries of practice because a human mechanic, anthropologist refused to ignore someone's tears. She made that almost laugh sound. Torian would have loved this. He always said tradition should serve well-being, not the other way around. He sounds like he was wise. He was. And he would have liked you, I think. You share his belief that the right thing to do is usually the simple thing. Help when help is needed. Be present when presence matters. Care when caring is difficult. They stood together in their shared quarters, looking out at the stars visible through the viewport. Somewhere among those distant lights was Earth, where Marcus had started his journey. Somewhere else was the Velisari homeworld, where Solara had learned to hide her grief behind perfect composure. And here, on Constellation Station, they'd found something neither had expected, healing through unlikely connection, strength through shared vulnerability, and proof that compassion could bridge any distance when offered with genuine heart. "Thank you," Solara said quietly, "for seeing what I tried to hide, for responding when you could have looked away, for bearing witness to my grief when I thought I had to carry it alone." "Thank you for letting me," Marcus replied, "for trusting me with something so personal, for teaching me about your culture and your loss and your healing, for showing me that connection doesn't require perfect understanding, just willingness to try." Solara took his hand, the gesture that had started everything, that had transformed a formal ritual into genuine bond. "Kesharvel," she said softly. "Grief-bearer," Marcus translated. "Soul companion, friend." All of those. And proof that sometimes the most important traditions are the ones we create together, across species and cultures, when we dare to respond to each other's pain with simple, uncomplicated kindness. They stood in comfortable silence, two unlikely companions bound by a moment of vulnerability and the choice to respond with compassion rather than distance. The galaxy was vast and complex, filled with countless species and infinite cultural variations. But some truths remained constant across all those differences. Pain was universal. Isolation made it worse. And sometimes, all it took to change someone's life was being willing to hold their hand in the darkness and refuse to let go. Marcus had learned that lesson the night he reached across formal distance to comfort someone who was suffering. Solara had learned it when she allowed herself to accept that comfort instead of retreating into isolated strength. Together, they'd proven that the most profound connections often begin with the simplest acts, seeing pain, acknowledging it, and choosing to help carry it. The rest, as they'd discovered, would follow naturally, as long as they faced it together.